We are looking today at Colossians chapter 1, and we are going to relook at verses 12 through 23. And I told you last week that we were going to do this, and I told you that the reason was last week we were looking at who Jesus was, and this week we're looking at what he did for us, right? And you cannot separate the two of them, even though we're doing it in two separate sermons. But the reality is you can't. They cannot be separated. Who he is led directly to what he did, and what he did was only possible because of who he was. So last week we established that he is very much God, the creator of the universe. He's not a God, he is the God, right? And he is God in all of his glory, revealed to mankind so that we may see God, so that we may interact with God, so that we may be, and what we're going to find today, reconciled with God. And so if you are there, let's look at the book of Colossians. And I did back this up one more verse this week because there's something I want to grab out of verse 12. So let's start in Colossians 1, verse 12. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel. That is, the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. So there's a lot of stuff in there of what Jesus has done for us. And it's neat to look at it and to pick it apart, right? It's easy to go, well, Jesus saved us, right? And that's the simple answer is, what did Jesus do for us? He saved us. But when we look through here in Colossians, that concept of he saved us, that concept of salvation has many parts to it, right? I have just gone through with my English students at the school that it's helpful to know the parts of a sentence to construct a sentence. It's helpful when you're looking in the trunk of, not the trunk, the front part of your car, under the hood, to understand the parts of the car if you're going to try to look and examine and go, oh yeah, that's why it's running, that's cool, and see. It's helpful to understand the parts. Well, Paul really kind of lifts out some of the parts of salvation here. And so as Christians, as people who walk with Christ, as people who say, hey, we're saved, it's nice to know what those parts are. Some may say, well, Gary, you're old school. Yeah, I am. I like that, right? You should know where a spark plug is if you're going to drive a car. All right, so in verse 12, he says, we thank God who has qualified us. So the first thing we see there is that he qualified us. You know the thing I love about that word qualified us, right? It indicates that we weren't qualified. right? He cannot qualify us if we are qualified, It's like saying, I made this when it was already made, right? And I love it when kids do that and they bring you a stick and go, look what I made. And you go, it's a stick. It was already made. It was on the ground. I saw it 5 minutes ago, right? We weren't qualified. We aren't on our own qualified to inherit, right? In fact, the Bible tells us that we were disqualified. Why? Because of our sin, right? Because you and I, we sinned. And sin disqualified us from the inheritance, right? It said, you know what? Here's the law, and the law says if you do every this, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you're good. And it turns out none of us could do all of it. We can't keep the law. And that's one of the things that Paul likes to point out over and over again, is that we all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right? And because we have sinned, we need somebody to come down and qualify us, to make it so that we are able to inherit, right? It's our sin caused us to lose holiness. On our own, we are not holy. And it says later on here in verse 22 that he made us holy again, right? Through his sacrifice. Through his bodily sacrifice, he offers us holiness, right? Through the death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. He qualifies us. That's the first thing he does. He qualifies us. And what does he qualify us for? He qualifies us to be inheritors of the kingdom of light. He qualifies us so that we may enter the kingdom of light. The next thing it says is, for he rescued us. The New King James says, delivered us. Right? He rescued us from what? From the dominion of darkness, or the power of darkness, the rule of darkness. We oftentimes will sing Amazing Grace. It's one of those songs that everybody knows. Sometimes we don't sing it enough because I'm not sure if the kids know it well enough yet, right? But in Amazing Grace, we talk about, I once was blind, but now I see, right? We dwelled in darkness. Well, the Bible has some things to say about darkness. The kingdom of darkness, right? And from Jesus' mouth, there's a statement of those who are part of the kingdom who reject Christ, those who were natural inheritors who get kind of tossed out because they aren't looking to Christ. They aren't qualified. They've been disqualified for their sin, right? They belong to the kingdom of darkness. And Jesus says it this way. He says, the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right? Outside of the city gates is the idea here. Outside in the wilderness where there is pain and there is suffering. Right? Because we were disqualified. We belonged in this kingdom of darkness. The dominion of darkness. And he is now, not only did he qualify us, but he rescued us. He said, come into the kingdom of light. Right? Come in and be a part of this. Step away from where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, where there is joy and peace. We are rescued, or we are delivered, right, into this kingdom. I was talking with someone yesterday, and he said, that's one of those things that we tend to forget as believers. We look so much at our own thing that we forget that we are delivered into a kingdom, right? And so in a kingdom, it's not just about me. Out there in the darkness, it's about me and mine. And in the kingdom, it's about us. It's about we. Each man guards each man's dignity, right? And so we're rescued. That's what it says. And then in verse 14, he has another way of saying it. Not only were we qualified, not only were we rescued, but we were given redemption, right? in whom we have redemption. We were redeemed, right? We were qualified, we were rescued, and we were redeemed. That word redeemed, I love it because the illustration that always comes into my head is the soda can. You know? The soda can, this empty piece of aluminum, which, the other day I was taking stuff out of my car, and there was a soda can that was completely crushed, right? It's a piece of trash. It's worthless. But you take the soda can, this empty thing of aluminum, that's worthless because you're not going to use the soda can for anything else, and you take it to the redemption center, and they redeem it, and they give you 5 cents. Right? And you go, well, I already paid for that 5 cents, so they're giving me the 5 cents back. They're taking this piece of trash and giving you 5 cents because, you can go on the side of the road and find soda cans, and I didn't pay for those soda cans. I found them, and I get my 5 cents, right? And that's the idea of redemption, is that we had no real worth when we were out there in the darkness, when we were out there by ourselves in the weeping and the gnashing of the teeth. We have no worth outside of Christ until we have his redemption. Until he brings us in. The redemption, he says, the forgiveness of sins. Another way to think of it is sins. The way we think of sins, it's unrighteousness. And we think, oh, well, we're pretty good people. But the book of Isaiah says, all of our righteous deeds are as dirty cloths. Right? Because we're disqualified, because we're in the darkness, we're like dirty cloths, dirty, muddy cloths. Actually, the word in Isaiah would be bloody cloths, but imagine trying to wash your car with a cloth that's caked with mud. Right? It just doesn't work. And Aaron's cringing because it scratches the paint and ruins the car, right? That cloth is worthless until you take the cloth and you get rid of the mud, until you wash it off. I'm glad for the washing machine. Throw the dirty cloth in, it comes out, it's clean. We've had some really disgusting cloths in our house, and they come out and they're white again, right? Jesus took us who were disqualified, those of us who were outside in the darkness, under the power of darkness, and blind to the light, and the weeping of gnashing of teeth. He took the dirt from off of us, forgave us of our sins, and made us clean again so that we were worth something. Like a clean cloth. Like a new vessel. Right? So he qualified us. He rescued us. He redeemed us. And then if we jump to verse 20, he reconciled us. And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Right? He reconciles us. Reconciling. That word to reconcile, it's used 3 times in the entire Bible. It is not really found too much in Greek prior to the word that's used here. It's not used prior to Paul. Right? They don't really see it before Paul came on the scene and he was writing this. And so we see it here in Colossians. We see it twice, once in verse 20, once in verse 21. And we see it in Ephesians. And that idea is really that he's making right. And in Christ is making it right through himself. Right? And it seems to be a word that only works for Christ. Taking something that was wrong, something that didn't work, and something that kept us separate from him. And our sin separates us from God. That's what Isaiah tells us. That sin separates us from God. And here we see that Christ brings us back together. He makes that relationship right. And it's interesting, in verse 20, his reconciliation isn't just for you and me. right? It's not just for us. It says, through him to reconcile to himself all things. You go, well, what does that mean? Well, he clarifies that. Whether things on earth or things in the heaven. Right? Everything, physical and spiritual. All of creation. When Adam and Eve sinned, all of creation was sent out into this spiral of destruction. And through Christ, there is reconciliation. There is this making of things right. Oftentimes, Paul has written that the whole earth groaned until the coming of Christ. That it yearned as a woman in childbirth and child labors for the coming of Christ. We read again in the book. I love Isaiah. I guess I keep going back to Isaiah today. Isaiah really does have a lot to do with salvation and that salvation message. In Isaiah gives a prophecy that one day the lion will lay down with the lamb. The child will play in the snake's pit and not be bitten. Right? Because all of nature will be at harmony together again at one point. Many believe that's what the Garden of Eden was like in the first place. And I know my wife is afraid of snakes, so for a child to be able to play in a snake pit without any problem, that's a miracle for her. Right? Reconciliation is that bringing back together, that making it right. That making things right. And he says he did it through his blood. And let's face it, this is where that connection comes in. That connection comes in of the, you know what? If it were anyone else on the cross, that blood could not have done this. Right? Because you and me, we're just people. We may be pretty good. We may be pretty nice. But if we're put up on a cross, our blood isn't going to redeem somebody. Right? My blood is, and let alone, it's not going to redeem an individual. It's not going to redeem all of creation. Right? The magnitude of what he did can only be possible because he was God. If we lose the deity of Christ, we lose all of what we just talked about. We lose the qualification. Because you know what? You and I can't qualify somebody. You and I, we can't rescue somebody from darkness and bring them into the light. You know, only Jesus can do that. Only God can do that. You know, it's like saying I can go to Brazil and find a naturally born Brazilian and bring him up to America and say, all right, you're a citizen now, right? I can't do that. I don't have that authority. Only the United States government can make that Brazilian a citizen. Right? The government has that authority. So only the king can make somebody from darkness into a citizen of the kingdom of light. I can't redeem a person. I can't give them value. I don't have that kind of power. I mean, they may be valued in my eyes, but it's different. Right? And I cannot reconcile somebody with God. The only people I can reconcile somebody with is me. Right? I can't make things right between two other people. They have to make that decision. We can't reconcile other people for them. Right? Because in reconciliation, that means somebody did something wrong and somebody else needs to forgive. Right? And God's the only one who can say, you know what, I forgive you of the things you did wrong to me. And if you want to put this into perspective, David's prayer after he had killed Uriah the Hittite, after he had cheated on, after he had relations with Uriah's wife before killing Uriah the Hittite, David's prayer was, God, against you and you alone have I sinned. That's the perspective we have here. Our sins are against God. Everything we do, whether it's squabbling with our siblings or our spouse, or our sins are against God. And only God can reconcile us to God. And if that's not enough, Paul goes into this idea of reconciliation a little bit more. He says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds. Right? And you go, well, wait a minute. I never thought of God as my enemy. Right? Even when I was as lost as sin, God was never in my mind my enemy. Well, we may not have thought of him as our enemy, but we acted as though he were. Right? And Paul writes this again in Ephesians, right? For he, and this is where that other word reconciliation comes in. For he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, and that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who were afar off, and to those who are near. For through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father. You see, we had enmity with God. We were enemies of God when we said in our head, when we thought, you know what, I know the will of God is this. God says, don't do that. Well, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. Right? And, you know, I can tell you that in my life there have been times where I've done that. Right? I know this is the right thing to do, but I don't want to do that. Right? There have been times, and it's easy to picture when you're dealing with children. Instead of calling my children out, because all three of them have done this, right? I could call myself out, right? There have been times when my parents have said, don't you do that. And, you know, as a child, you look at your parent and you go, don't do this. You mean this? Right? And you do it. And I think we've all done that. Well, the reality is at that point, we're enmity with God, right? We're enmity with our parents. We are fighting against what they asked us to do. Going against the very thing they said don't do. Well, we've dealt with how Paul says it. Let's look at how James says it. James, and I believe that the author of James here is James, the brother of Christ, right? Who later became the head of the church of Jerusalem, right? As opposed to James the apostle. But James here in James chapter 4, verse 4, he says, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. You know, we may not have said in our head we're an enemy to God, but when we say, you know what, God said that was wrong, but the world says everybody's doing it, and so it must be okay, we're making ourselves enemies of God in our heads, in our minds. Even if we're not partaking in the things that the world is saying is okay, that God called us in. When we start saying, no, it's all right. We're enemies with God. And Paul goes on in verse 21 of Colossians chapter 1. He says, we're enemies of God in our mind because we're thinking it's okay to disobey him. And because we think it's okay to disobey him, we do. Right? We do. And the reality is, even as believers, even as Christians, we stumble and we fall and we look at it and go, God, I know you said this, but that looks much better. Right? We do. We fall short. And so we again need reconciliation. We need to turn to him, the one who has qualified us, the one who has rescued us, the one who has redeemed us, and the one who reconciles us. It says he reconciled us through the physical death of his body, through the death on the cross. Right? All of this was that God, the creator of the universe, stepped down from heaven, was born out as a baby, lived a sinless, perfect life, and walked to the cross to pay the sins, to show that there was enmity, there was pain caused, and he took the pain upon himself at the cross. That's what he did for us. Right? And if it's not enough to glorify him and worship him because he is God, if it's not enough to glorify him and worship him because, he created everything and he holds the world together, maybe it should be enough to worship him, to follow him, to obey him because he died for us, to offer us these things, to offer us all of those things. And our last thought is found in verse 23 there. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. You see, Jesus did all of that. Now it's our turn to respond. Right? That's the last part of this whole equation. Jesus did the sacrificing, he did the dying, he did the reconciling and the redeeming and the rescuing and the qualifying, and all we need to do really is respond. And Paul says, look, we got to hold to that faith. We got to hold to that response. The reality is that once we respond, once we give ourselves over to Christ, there really is no turning back. Right? One of the things that you note in here is he doesn't say that hope that you took a hold of, that hope that you made a part of yourself. He said the hope you heard. Right? We hold to the faith when we take hold of that hope, when we incorporate it in ourselves, and we choose to follow him, to make him Lord of our lives. And so, have you responded? I'm sure for most of us, the answer is yes, I have. And the reality is there's glory to that. The next thing is, are you going to share that idea with other people? So that they can also be qualified and be rescued and be redeemed and be reconciled. Because there's a world out there that doesn't know him. In fact, we live in a day and age where biblical illiteracy is at its highest. Last year I asked my kids if they knew who Samson was, because it was mentioned in one of the stories we were reading. None of them knew who Samson was. Right? Basic biblical story. They don't know Jesus. And so it's our job to tell them, so that they have a chance to grab on to what they've heard. So that they have a chance. But before we can do that, we need to respond and accept and follow him. Will you bow with me in prayer?